Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the March edition of our Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society History Hour. And this is entitled A Mine, a Mistress, and a Murder. It's about the boss of the Bay Mine that was located in Sullivan or Sorrento. And we are here with Sam Younger, Sorrento historian. He is here to teach us about this interesting tidbit of history. So Sam, I will pass it away to you.
Thank you so much. Can you see my full presentation? There we go.
Yes,
Is that better?
indeed. There we are.
Okay. Thanks for all for coming out. First, I posted this story a few years ago, but since then have turned up a few more interesting details. And while this connects back to a mining company that was established about 140 years ago in what was then Sullivan, most of my story is going to revolve around events that happened in New York City. This was a good project for me, and I hope you all enjoy it. This covers not only Sullivan history, but also some other areas that I'm interested in, particularly legal history, the history of lawyers, the courts, and the place where I've worked for about 30 years. Hopefully I can get through this. So our tale begins in New York City in 1883, 140 years ago this week. Sunday, March 18th had been an unseasonably warm day in New York, and the New York Times reported that it had been the first really pleasant Sunday of the year. Large numbers of people were again out walking, and some restaurants even opened up their outdoor pavilions for dining. In newspapers that week, there had been other stories about the ceremonies being planned for the Brooklyn Bridge opening that was going to be opening in May. The next day, Monday, March 19th, would be the last day of winter. And that evening, sometime around 9 o'clock, a New York City police officer named James Mantle was on routine patrol in Manhattan. And as he wandered up 8th Avenue, he came to the front of the Grand Opera House and was approached by a man who'd come from the direction of 23rd Street. A 27-year-old man, later identified as George Conkling, a US government field surveyor who was visiting from Nevada, calmly walked up to the officer and told him he needed to surrender himself because he had just shot a man and guessed he's going to die. Conkling said the shooting had occurred in an apartment in the Paris Flats just down the block. He had been involved in a confrontation with another man when the fight escalated and the man picked up a small statue from the fireplace mantel and threw it at him. Feeling threatened, Conkling told the officer he fired his gun a single time, hitting his victim in the chest. The man he shot, he revealed, was his sister's boyfriend, 30-year-old William Haverstick. The only witness to the shooting and the person central to their fight was Conkling's sister, 29-year-old Emma Euler. Officer Mantle walked the shooter to the 16th Precinct House on West 20th Street to process the confessed killer. At the station house, he was turned over to his superiors, and Captain McElwain was dispatched to the apartment building accompanied by detectives. When the police arrived, they found the victim dead on the floor of the front parlor. Also in the present were two women and two other men who identified themselves as doctors. One of the women, Emma Euler, told police that immediately after the shooting, she asked the building's janitor to run for help. Dr. Thomas Healy was the first to arrive from his house on West 23rd Street. When questioned by police, Dr. Healy said when he arrived, the victim was still alive. The doctor also told police that the last words the injured man had said before he died was, "A young man shot me. George Conkling shot me. He shot me down like a dog, but I forgive him. He didn't mean it." Before he took his last breath, the doctor said Haverstick said his final words were, "God bless my mother." Shortly after Haverstick died, another doctor arrived on the scene. The second doctor had been summoned by Emma Euler's maid and was Emma's personal physician, Dr. R.W. Amidon, an expert in nervous diseases. This was not the first murder scene that the doctor had witnessed. Only a few months earlier, on October 31st, Dr. Amidon observed what he described as the most ghastly sights he had ever witnessed. That event happened at a house a few blocks away on West 21st Street, where his sister lived with her husband, Dr. Edward Seguin, another doctor well known as a specialist in nervous diseases and insanity. Dr. Amidon was in the habit of visiting his sister's house to check on her well-being, and because she'd been subject to the blues and despondent. On this evening visit on Halloween, the family porters indicated that his sister had never returned from a walk to the park with her children. Amidon, suspecting otherwise, rushed to the top floor where he knocked on the door, getting no response, kicked the door in. With the door open, Dr. Amidon saw his sister Margaret, dead on the floor with a pearl-handled .38 caliber pistol laying by her side. Scattered around the room were her three children, Edward, age 6, John, age 5, and Jeanette, age 4, all dead from gunshot wounds to the head. Their mother had blindfolded the children and tied their hands behind their backs before shooting them. In addition to the .38 caliber pistol, there was another longer-barreled parlor pistol on the floor, and on the bed, a two-barreled silver-plated Derringer pistol and a box of cartridges. In the aftermath of the tragedy, his brother-in-law was reported paralyzed. Dr. Amidon was also reported despondent at not having recognized just how depressed his sister had been, although he indicated that they had both done their best to cheer her up. In what was perhaps one of the greatest understatements ever, a skeptical New York City police captain said of the husband, how he could live with this woman and not discover the fact that she was insane is one of the mysteries of the medical profession. In a later inquest, no wrongdoing by any of the survivors or staff employed in the house was found. Less than 6 months later, Dr. Amidon was called to the site of another shooting, this time at the apartment of his patient, Emma Euler. The shooter in this new case was Emma's brother, George Conkling. It was reported that Emma had been living in the Paris flat apartment with the dead man after abandoning her husband, Emma Euler, and her two children. The headlines the next day revealed a possible motive for the killing and indicated that Conkling was simply wiping out a disgrace. And Conkling told police that the shooting had occurred as he attempted to convince Emma to leave New York City with him, forsaking not only her lover, but her family as well. In defending his sister's honor, Conkling may very well have been justified in killing Haverstick. Following the crime, the New York City police and the coroner were charged with conducting an investigation. Conkling was eventually sent to the infamous Tombs prison on Center Street to await charging decisions by the district attorney. Meanwhile, his sister Emma Euler was taken to a New York hospital by Dr. Amidon, where she was reported in a wretched condition, both physically and mentally, with one paper saying, if she recovers, she will probably be insane. During the late 1870s and early 1880s, copper and silver mines lined the banks of the Taunton River in Sullivan. Most mines were searching for lodes of silver, but one mine, the Golden Circle, on what is today known as Treasure Island in Sorrento, was hunting for gold. More than a dozen mines were in operation in the area around Sullivan, and these companies were financed by another market, the sale of stock traded on mining exchanges established in Bangor and Boston. The mines had quickly become a significant business in Sullivan, competing with the other major industry, granite quarries. The mining infrastructure consisted of open mine shafts, many located near the high water mark along the shores above Tidal Falls. Teams of men descended underground to drill, blast, load, and haul the stones to the surface. The rock then moved to facilities built to crush and process the ore. Extraction of the valuable metals could be done by various methods, either by concentrating, which used water to separate the heavier ore from the rock, or by smelting, which used high heat to form molten ore, or milling methods, which use chemicals such as mercury or chlorine to leach the ore from the rock. Steam-powered furnaces fueled by coal or wood were needed to extract each one of these methods. All of this industrial activity is in great contrast to what we think of our rural Hancock County today. But if you look carefully, the byproduct of some of these mining operations can still be seen today in piles of rock tailings found along the river. In August 1880, the son of Harvard President Charles Eliot, also named Charles, and his friends, who were all students at the university, chartered a sloop named the Sunshine and hired as their captain a young man from Sullivan named Orrin Donnell, who had been born in Franklin. Orrin would go on to work for the Eliot family as their captain for the rest of his life. And thank you, Toby, for helping me do some research. I learned a little bit more about Orrin, that he had moved to the Daniel Sullivan property on Waukeag Neck around when he was around 10 years old. And I suspect that he got to know the Eliot family during the 2 or 3 summers when the Harvard president and his sons camped on Calf Island 10 years earlier in the 1870s. And when the younger Eliot decided to return to Maine a few summers later with his friends from college, who made their camp on Mount Desert Island, he hired Orrin again. The college boys hiked the island, studied its flora and fauna, and they also explored the area aboard the Sunshine, all with Orrin as their guide. One of these trips took them to Sullivan and gives us a glimpse of the mining activities. On the morning of Tuesday, August 17th, the group sailed from Seal Cove over to Bar Harbor, where they spent most of the day. Late in the afternoon, the boys ran in a light breeze downwind across Frenchman's Bay and into Sullivan Harbor, arriving around 6 p.m. After mooring the boat and eating supper, they rowed ashore to visit the Waukeag House on the hill above the harbor, where they may have raised a pint or two. Returning to the boat about 10:30, their log entry notes the glorious moonlight on the water, as well as the reflection of the light in the sky, which they attributed to the smoke, possibly from the mines, that had been thick that afternoon. The next morning, their log notes that the smoke, which had been very thick the day before, had dissipated overnight, and the boys spent the day exploring the various mining operations, including a visit to see the new reduction works at the Sullivan mine used in the ore extraction process. A month before the group of young adventurers sailed over to Sullivan, a report published in the Maine Mining Journal indicated that a fine piece of copper property had so impressed some men from New York that, unlike the other Sullivan Mining Company shares, they intended to place the company's stock not on the Boston or Bangor exchange, but on the New York Mining Exchange. The new mine would be called the Boss of the Bay Mine, and it was going to be sited away from the other operations clustered around Tidal Falls, and instead was located opposite the Golden Circle mine on what today is named Treasure Island. Several men later named as directors of the company negotiated agreements for the mineral rights on land owned by Elijah Doan and his wife. near where the point that today bears their name. The first lease was signed in April 1880 by Edward Noyes of Sullivan, and another lease was negotiated in September by J. Carey French of Lemoyne. The leases called for the Doanes to be paid a rent of $2,000 a year, as well as a grant of 1,000 shares in the new company. It gave them the full power to build wharves and bridges and do other means of acts or things necessary and proper for the working of the mines, metals, minerals, and ores within, upon, or under said premise. And the Doanes negotiated a similar lease the same year with the operators of the Golden Circle mine on Soward's Island. On July 29th, 1880, the Boss of the Bay Mine Company was incorporated, and a report listed that its president would be Joseph Wilcox of the Storrs Brothers firm in Brooklyn. Shaler Eldridge of Colorado would be its secretary and treasurer, and J. Clement Uslet, a director. The incorporation paperwork on file with the Hancock County clerk with the names and officers also indicates that the company was authorized for manufacturing, mining, or chemical purposes. Funding for the mine would be raised by the sale of 200,000 shares of stock, set to be traded on the New York Mining Exchange at $5 per share. Several days later, a correction was published. The first mistake was that J. Clement Euler, now spelled correctly, would in fact be the president of the new mining company. The second edition of another officer of the new company was its secretary, W.H. Haverstick. Finally, it was noted that an additional 5,000 shares would be put on the New York Mining Exchange at $1 a share and not $5. Through the summer of 1880, the Maine Mining Journal continued to print positive stories about the new mine. This news included reports about the construction of a new pier and a large blacksmithing shop progressing at the site. The final quote said, "This looks like business." And at the end of September, it teased that more news from the Boss of the Bay was anticipated whenever the mine superintendent returned from a trip out west. A week later, promising news about the two mines on Waukegan Neck was published in a national trade magazine. The Golden Circle was actively erecting a shaft house, and it was almost complete. Meanwhile, good progress was underway at the Boss of the Bay mine on its copper exploration, and they had even found a continuation of the Golden Circle vein on its property. The mining boom in Sullivan would prove short-lived, however, and would collapse over the next few years. The country was on the verge of entering an economic slowdown that would last through 1885. And while this story may have been the last report I could find about the Boss of the Bay mine, it would not be the last news about the men who had founded the company, J. Clement Euler and William Haverstick. 3 years later, papers across the country were filled with news about the shooting on West 23rd Street in New York City, and the salacious events surrounding the victim, first identified only as a broker who had seduced his partner's wife. Following Conkling's arrest, he identified his victim as William Haverstick. He said Haverstick was his sister's lover, and who had lured her away to live with him in Manhattan, abandoning both her husband, J. Clement Euler, and her children. Haverstick and Euler, if you haven't guessed by now, were the promoters of the mine. In reports about the shooting, the Brooklyn Eagle said that neighbors in the building on 23rd Street had complained about the unmarried couple living together in the apartment. It went on to editorialize that the skirmish was one of the disadvantages of apartment living. It's certainly more comfortable to choose one's own companions and to have a home in which there's no annoyance from flying mantel ornaments, wandering bullets, or ineffaceable bloodstains on the floors and stairs. A few years later, The chief of police of New York City, George Walling, also recalled the events of the shooting in his memoirs of 38 Years on the Force, Recollections of a New York City Police Chief. Walling provided the additional details that Euler had married Emma Conkling, then 19 years old, in San Francisco, while he was engaged in a prior business in California. After their marriage in 1871, the couple moved to New York City, where Emma had several children, and Euler entered into a partnership with Haverstick. Emma, according to Walling, became infatuated with Haverstick, who succeeded in seducing her. The mining operation in Maine, while seemingly founded with great promise, likely fell apart in the midst of this affair between Euler and his partner's wife. Between Euler's partner and his wife, sorry. Walling writes that when Mrs. Euler left in bed and bored, he did little besides protest against an act that would bring disgrace upon both families. On the surface, it seemed the case was pretty straightforward. The police had a dead body, a confessed killer, and a likely motive. Although Walling was the chief of police in New York at the time, he didn't control the investigation. Those details were left to the city's coroner to compile and would present them to a jury. Conkling, meanwhile, was sent to Murderers Row in the Tombs on Center Street to await an inquest where the cause of death could be established. And following that, a determination by the district attorney as to whether he would face a trial for murder or some lesser charge. Conkling would not face those hearings alone. William F. Howe, one of the giants of the New York City criminal bar, was hired to defend Conkling. Howe's presence would not come cheap, but Conkling would be in capable hands. Howe was known not only for his flamboyant style, but his skill at staging courtroom theatrics to sway juries and judges. And over the course of his career, he represented over 600 accused murderers. William Howe and his partner, Abe Hummell, were easily located by their clients at their office located directly across the street from the Tombs prison. During the late 19th century, the pair successfully defended the most notorious criminals in New York. The lawyers are worthy of their own lecture, and there have been several entertaining books written about their exploits. And one biographer called the two criminal lawyers who might better be described as criminals who practice law. And one of their adversaries once pronounced them as crooked as the horns of a Dorset ram. In addition to his dramatic courtroom performances, Howe was famous for his loud style of dress. "I like diamonds," he explained. "I love their glitter and their sparkle." While the pair happily made their fortune representing a host of thieves, murderers, and prostitutes, they were also accused of crossing the line by employing bribery, blackmail, and suborning perjury to advance their clients' cases. After the turn of the century, Howe died while under investigation by a crusading district attorney, and Hummell was forced to flee the country one step ahead of the law and disbarment proceedings. William Howe would not be Conkling's only attorney. Conkling, also joining the defense team, was a prominent California attorney named Cameron H. King, the real lawyer, as one newspaper called him. Conkling evidently had the resources and connections to hire not only the most well-known New York City criminal attorney, but also one of California's best-known and influential attorneys, described as one of his old personal friends. A few years earlier, King had successfully convinced the jury to acquit his client, photographer Edward Muybridge, who had shot and killed his wife's lover. In that case, King argued that his client should be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and brought many of Muybridge's friends in to testify that he was emotionally unstable. But the jury disregarded the insanity defense and acquitted Muybridge on the grounds of justifiable homicide. After this acquittal, Muybridge went on a few years later to do his famous works of stop time photography. Also present in New York to lend support for Emma and George was a friend of the family, a famous San Francisco theatrical producer named Tom McGuire. How the family was affording to pay for all these lawyers isn't known, but it's possible that McGuire was helping to coordinate the financing of the defense. However, one newspaper indicated that McGuire had also known the victim, and before he went into business with Euler, had even offered Haverstick work as an actor in some of his productions. Luckily for Conkling, justice at the time moved swiftly, and the coroner's inquest to examine the facts surrounding the shooting was scheduled to begin just days later. While Conkling remained in jail, the coroner surveyed the apartment and inspected the victim to find where the bullet had entered the body. Although the coroner could not bring charges, the public inquest would be the first chance for the defense lawyers to present their case. With their young client possibly facing indictment for murder and if found guilty, an encounter with either a long jail sentence or the hangman's noose, his lawyer's first goal was to try to minimize the charges against Conkling. And one of their hopes for a downgraded charge was to show that the self-confessed killer didn't deliberately shoot Haverstick, but instead was motivated in the heat of passion. The first person called at the inquest was his sister's maid, who was only able to testify that she was not in the room when Haverstick was shot, but that she was asked to run for a doctor after the shooting. However, she also testified that there was another fight that occurred that night before Conkling arrived. That one was between Haverstick and Emma, and that Haverstick had slapped Emma. The next day, the inquest continued with the testimony of more police officers and the doctors who were called to the apartment after the shooting. Both Dr. Healy and Detective Campbell had arrived before Haverstick died, and both testified that Haverstick told them that Conkling was the shooter. The doctor repeated that what appeared in the headlines the next morning, that Haverstick said, "He shot me like a dog." The detective was able to testify that he found the broken statue that Conkling said Haverstick had thrown at him during the altercation. Captain McElwain of the 20th Precinct, who had been in charge of guarding the prisoner after his arrest, was next on the stand. He said Conkling told him that when he had gone into the apartment to take his sister away, he was met by Haverstick, who flew into a terrible rage. When Haverstick attacked him, the two men struggled for a few seconds before Haverstick threw the statue in his direction. He said Conkling had told him that it was then that he pulled out his pistol and fired one round in self-defense. The officer said Conkling told him, "God knows he brought it on himself." And when asked about carrying the illegal pistol, the prisoner told him, "Out west, every man was armed, and he kept the pistol here from habit." At the end of the day's session, Conkling's lawyer asked the coroner to release their client on bail, but that request was denied. Earlier in the week, Haverstick's associates at the mining exchange passed a sympathetic resolution to help counter arguments coming out against the dead man. In it, they documented his integrity as a businessman and his uniform kindness and courtesy to his fellow members. One commentator called the resolution supporting Haverstick an unprincipled scoundrel who seduced women away from a decent home, a tender husband, and dear children. And it was an indecent thing, and instead suggested that Haverstick was a moral leper and a social plague who had lived like a beast and died like a dog. On Thursday, the star witness would appear, the only other person in the room when the shot was fired, Emma Euler. Despite being hospitalized after the shooting to recover from what was reported to be a nervous reaction to the incident, Emma made a dramatic appearance to provide testimony on her brother's behalf. The courtroom was packed with reporters, friends, and curiosity seekers. Knowing that she might hold the fate of her brother's life in her hands, Emma's nervousness was no doubt real. She trembled as she was escorted into the courtroom in the arms of a policeman and was reported to be wearing a black veil and what one reporter described as a glamorous outfit of maroon velvet, a sealskin wrap, and diamond earrings. Although well-dressed, another reporter said, "She is by no means beautiful." Emma wept as she looked across the room and saw her brother surrounded on both sides by his lawyers. As the coroner quizzed her about the events of the previous year that had led to her brother's appearance in New York City and ultimately Haverstick's murder, her voice was barely audible, and the coroner was forced to repeat her answers so that the rest of the courtroom could hear her replies. Emma's testimony revealed more of her story. She told the crowd how she and her husband, Clement Euler, had moved from California and settled in Brooklyn several years earlier with their 2 children. When Haverstick also arrived from California, her husband decided the men should pursue a business venture in New York. And because the couple had room in their home, Haverstick was invited to move in. Sometime in the year after the men founded the Boss of the Bay mine, Emma left her husband and children and moved into Manhattan with Haverstick to the apartment at the Paris Flats. It was later revealed that the couple had told the landlord that they were brother and sister to keep their illicit romance a secret. Emma said her separation from her husband was a mutual decision. She only left her husband because of their constant quarrels and his jealousy of Haverstick. Eventually, news of her affair got back to her brother, and he had arrived in New York 2 weeks before the shooting, determined to convince Emma to either reconcile with her husband or leave New York entirely. When her testimony finished, earlier on the day of the shooting, she said her brother had persuaded her to move back to California and said he would return later in the day to collect her. When George arrived that evening, they told Haverstick about her decision to leave, and a fight broke out between the 2 men. Conkling's attorney did their best to portray George in a sympathetic light and defender of his sister's honor. On the stand, Emma began to cry uncontrollably as she described how Haverstick rose, picked up an object from the mantel, threw it across the room at her brother. Early on the day of the shooting, she said her brother, can anybody hear me again? Good. Her brother had persuaded her to move back to California and said he would return later in the day to collect her. When a fight broke out between the 2 men. Conkling's attorney did their best to portray George in a sympathetic light and the defender of his sister and her honor. It's doing this again. On the stand, Emma began to cry uncontrollably. Somebody is trying to get in again. Decline. Can you still see me and hear me?
Yes, I can see your screen. Yep.
Can you see something that says Sam Younger is requesting a remote control of your screen?
No.
Okay, well, okay. I'll ignore that then. On the stand, Emma began to cry uncontrollably as she described how Haverstick rose and picked up an object from the mantel and threw it across the room at her brother. When questioned by George's attorney, a curious detail emerged when she revealed that a week before the shooting, Emma and George had visited the offices of Howe and Hummell in the wake of an earlier incident when Haverstick had hit her during an argument over her possible moving out. Upon hearing this testimony reread, she told the coroner, "Oh, leave that part out." Now I can't move. When Emma had finished her testimony, she was declared free to go, and the attorney Howe quickly whisked her out of the courtroom. After Emma was led out of the courtroom, the coroner read into evidence the results of his autopsy, which determined that the cause of death as a hemorrhage and shock. He then indicated that although he had subpoenaed Emma's husband, he refused to appear. The last witness called was the shooter, George Conkling. As he approached the stand, a friend in the crowd yelled out support, and his counsel told the court that although not required to testify, George was appearing voluntarily. He testified that he had arrived in New York City a few weeks earlier and made a visit to see his sister's husband, and attempted to convince him to reconcile with Emma. Euler told him that Haverstick had been his friend and business partner whom he had advanced money to buy a seat on the exchange. It had even been Euler's idea to invite Haverstick to move in with the couple to save on expenses when their business began to go poorly. He also told the room that he learned from Euler that his sister had become addicted to morphine, and Euler thought Haverstick might help him break her of the habit. Instead, Emma and Haverstick began their affair, and Emma's drug habit only got worse. As a result, Euler kicked Haverstick out of their house, and Emma soon followed, moving into the apartment on 23rd Street. Euler said he had no interest in reconciling, and he would not be giving the children back to his wife. Conkling said he eventually persuaded his sister to leave New York City entirely and return west with him. And when he arrived to pick her up, he came to blows with Haverstick. On the night of the shooting, Haverstick entered the room and yelled at Conkling, "By God, you can't take anything or anybody out of this house." Haverstick then picked up the statue, threw it at Conkling, yelling, "I'll fix you anyhow," Conkling said. It was only then that he fired the shot that killed Haverstick. Conkling's testimony didn't end until 5:30 in the evening, and the jury immediately went to deliberate for another hour before returning their verdict. They concluded that Haverstick had died from a bullet wound to the abdomen, and that the shot was fired under great provocation. The coroner said bail would not be considered for the prisoner until a criminal court could weigh in on the findings. His lawyer then stood up and told the court, "I instruct my client to refuse to answer any more questions. This whole business is a farce." And with that, the courtroom erupted in applause. Conkling lit a cigar and was escorted back to the Tombs to await the next chapter. The next day, his lawyers applied for bail before a Supreme Court justice who agreed that Conkling should be released on $5,000 bond. When Howe addressed the court, he proclaimed, "If this same gush had been applied to my sister, I would have shot the man." The judge, upset with the display of the courtroom erupting in applause, told anyone who continued to interrupt him that they would be arrested. Strangely, the judge concluded that he was reserving a decision to grant bail and instead scheduled a hearing the next day before another judge. The judge may have had good reason to be reluctant to decide the bail request, since a few years earlier, the same lawyers, Howe and Hummell, had been implicated in a bribery scheme associated with then Supreme Court Justice Albert Cardozo, the father of future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo. Cardozo's father had been forced off the New York City bench when an investigation found that he had been accepting bribes to sign release orders for Howe and Hummell clients who had been convicted in lower level crimes. It's said that the famous saying, "A good lawyer knows the law, but a great lawyer knows the judge," was coined to apply to Howe and Hummell. And so The next day, the lawyers made their arguments to release George on bail again, this time before a lower police court justice. George was brought to appear at the Special Sessions Court, where Police Justice Smith reviewed the findings to determine if he would have to remain at the Tombs while the DA decided his fate. This was not a trial level court, but rather one that usually heard cases such as disorderly conduct, public intoxication, and misdemeanor assault. Conkling's lawyer, Mr. King, argued for bail, saying, if ever a homicide was justifiable, it was this. District Attorney stood up next and urged the court to hold Conkling in custody for trial. But even before the prosecutor sat down, the justice announced his verdict. The defendant had reasonable grounds. He was under a great personal injury to him, and there was imminent danger, and the homicide was justifiable. With that, the judge announced the defendant is discharged. While Howe had cleverly positioned his client in front of the lower police court justice to release them on bail, there were many in New York who wanted justice served. And the New York Herald said, there has been altogether too much foolish sentiment in this matter. And the DA didn't intend to simply let Conkling disappear. He immediately impaneled a grand jury to hear the case and threatened to have Conkling rearrested. The next week, Emma was called again to testify, this time at the grand jury. In defending his decision, though, to release Conkling on bail, police justice did admit that if a justifiable homicide was a crime, perhaps he may have been wrong in discharging Conkling. Having run the wheels of justice in their client's favor so far, and successfully earning sympathy for Conkling during this initial phase, his lawyers no doubt thought there was a good chance that they could eventually convince a jury to side with their client and earn an acquittal for Conkling at trial, on the grounds that the killing was indeed justified. As part of their preparations to defend their client, the lawyers planted information that seemingly placed doubt about Haverstick's character. He was portrayed as essentially a cold, hard, and at the same time a shrewd man, one of that class of modern rakes to whom nothing is sacred, who take a satisfaction in robbing others of their all, even the affections of their wives. One friend was quoted as saying, Conkling served him right. It's a good thing he is gone. While the DA announced that he expected the trial to begin quickly, George and Emma made plans to leave New York City and were reportedly ready to board a train for Reno, Nevada. But a week later, everyone gathered again in a courtroom ready for the trial to begin, when the DA suddenly announced that he was requesting a delay because he had begun an investigation that would take the gush out of this so-called domestic drama. That news seemingly caught Conkling's lawyer, William Howe, off guard, and he strenuously requested a speedy trial. The judge, however, granted the DA's request and postponed the trial until September. With the date delayed, Emma and George could finally leave New York, but not before Emma made a desperate attempt to see her children, who were staying with relatives in Pennsylvania. Her husband had given instructions not to allow her in the house, and Emma was left crying on the doorstep before being taken away by her maid. There's one other odd detail that delayed their departure. Her doctor had been holding cash and valuables from the apartment, and he had refused to return those to Emma until threatened by a lawsuit from Mr. Hummell. It appears that Conkling did return to New York City that fall to stand trial, but oddly, there's no other news about the case. So it's possible that the DA had not finished his investigations and requested yet another delay. Early the next year, the DA's case came to an abrupt end on Valentine's Day, when Emma, then just 29, was found dead, evidently the victim of a morphine overdose. With the only eyewitness to the shooting of Haverstick now dead, Conkling's attorneys moved to dismiss the charges against George, and his trial for manslaughter never went forward. Emma had returned to New York City toward the end of 1883, moved into an apartment under an assumed name. And while it's possible she came back for her brother's trial, she may have also wanted to be near her children, although there's no indication that any reconciliation with her husband ever occurred. Other articles provided more background on her return, and it was rumored that Emma was staying in fast houses, but had moved into a respectable boarding house where she died. As to her fate, the New York Times said it was uncertain if her death was accidental or suicide. Chief Walling was not so kind. He later wrote, Mrs. Euler did not reform. She contracted the opium habit and died a wretched death in this city. William Howe, her brother's attorney, said, I'm not surprised by her sudden death, for I never saw her but what she was under the influence of morphine. Emma had obviously been deeply traumatized by the love affair, the loss of her children, and later by Haverstick's death at her brother's hand. But those events no doubt furthered her decline in addiction. As an interesting aside, on the same day that Emma was found dead, a few blocks, 30 blocks north in New York City, Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, Alice, and his mother, Mittie, also died in his home. And after that tragedy, Roosevelt famously left New York City for a few years to work on a ranch in the Dakota Territory. And he would later return to New York City and be named police commissioner, and he tried to reform that corrupt organization before becoming president. Emma's family attempted to defend her honor by releasing news that her death had been ruled accidental and her drug use was only the fault which can be proved against her. But her family made no move to claim her body. Instead, despite the heartbreak the affair had caused him, J. Clement Euler, her husband, assumed responsibility to bury his wife. When asked whether he recognized her body, he simply replied without emotion, yes, I recognize her, but she's changed in the last 3 years. He also thought her death was a result of accidental overdose to morphine, a finding which was later confirmed by an autopsy. In a final ironic twist, another woman who said she was a friend of the family from California also came forward and volunteered to make the final arrangements for Emma. However, she said she wasn't able to financially because she had lost all of her money in mining stocks in California and only earned a meager living by her own hands. The last chapter of this sad tale involves the gunman, George Conkling. Although the DA dismissed the manslaughter charges after his sister's death, a few months later, George contracted tuberculosis, and by May, he too had died in San Francisco. The only one who seemed to escape unscathed from the events was Emma's husband, Clement Euler. He would go on to have a successful business career and served as a secretary for the Spreckels Sugar Corporation. He was a member of the board of directors when the company was acquired by the Havermeyer Sugar Trust in 1891, becoming the largest sugar monopoly in the world. Euler, who wouldn't marry again, lived out his days with his children in a townhouse on Manhattan's West 70th Street. The case raised quite a few questions in my mind, especially when several important facts about the affair were never revealed by the shrewd attorney, Mr. Howe. One detail never revealed by Conkling's attorney during the inquest was one that probably sealed the fate of the Boss of the Bay mine 3 years earlier. Rather than the passive husband that the defense attorneys portrayed him, Clement Euler was well aware of the affair between his wife and Haverstick. Euler was also well aware of his wife's drug habit, which began after she lost her third child. A year after the partners founded the company, Euler hired New York City detectives to investigate meetings between the couple, his wife and Haverstick. When the affair was confirmed, Euler dissolved the partnership and had his lawyer apply for an arrest warrant against Haverstick for enticing away his wife. Another important detail that was not revealed in the coroner's inquest was when Euler had Haverstick arrested back in 2 years earlier in 1881, Emma had hired Howe and Hummell, the same law firm that would later represent her brother, to represent her in divorce proceedings against her husband on the grounds of cruel and inhuman treatment, where she asked for alimony. She claimed she was driven from her home and children. In turn, Euler filed an answer detailing Emma's betrayals and the proof of the affair the detectives had uncovered. At the same time, he sued Haverstick for alienating the affections of his wife and demanded $25,000 in damages. And reports of the time said that a fight between the partners promises to be of lively character. Was all of this part of the investigation that the DA was looking into that caused him to request a delay in the trial date? There was obviously a lot of hostility and even domestic violence among Haverstick and Emma. And some questions in my mind whether the whole shooting may have been premeditated. While it's certainly possible that Conkling fired the gun in a fit of passion, could it have been provoked by some other, perhaps financial dispute that was caused by the boss of the Bay mine? And evidently Euler had had a long relationship with both George and Emma and the entire Conkling family. In 1870, when he was 25, he had lived with the family in California before marrying then teenaged Emma. George Conkling, the younger brother, had been a mining engineer. Could he have been involved in the mining company that had gone bad? And what about all the connections to the law firm? Not only had Emma hired Howe and Hummell as her attorneys in the divorce suit, but in the weeks before the shooting, George had taken Emma to see Howe and Hummell to get advice on what to do about her sister's options. Is it possible that George had come to New York City with the intent to murder Haverstick? And was he carefully coached by her lawyers to make it look like a crime of passion? Hummell, of course, didn't let on to anything untoward about the affair. His only comment was the visit that Emma and her brother made to go see the firm was she had told them, go west with your brother. We'll never know if Howe and Hummell played a larger role in all the affairs or the shooting. And we'll never know if Clement Euler was somehow involved in orchestrating the death of his former partner, the man who broke up his family. Certainly he had motive to kill Haverstick. So as all of you are pondering the mysteries and motives for the murder, there really is no such doubt about the period of time when the mines lined the shores of Sullivan. The mining boom there was very short. In 1878, the Maine State Yearbook listed the very first mining enterprise, the Sullivan Silver Mining Company, alongside the other businesses in town, including 4 granite quarries. 3 years later, an entire new subheading was required to list the 11 mining companies. The country would soon enter a recession, however, and the fortunes of the mining firms in Sullivan quickly failed, with losses for all the holders of any stock. Some of the speculators in the mining companies may have cashed in during the bubble, but most of the investors were probably not so lucky. It's unknown whether any real production was ever seen from the mine shafts sunk on the shorelines in Sullivan, but we know that the markets and the stocks issued to fund those operations all crashed. One commentator even said, worthless mining company stock certificates now adorn the walls of suburban back rooms in lieu of ordinary wallpaper. A year later, there were 6 mining companies that remained in Sullivan. And note, by 1882, the boss of the Bay mine is not listed. A full year before the shooting, of Haverstick in New York City. We can only speculate on why the Boss of the Bay mine never succeeded. Did Euler and Haverstick's attempt to pump and dump the company's stock simply not succeed during the mining boom? Or was there some other relationship between the affair with Haverstick and the subsequent breakup of the partnership and the eventual murder of Haverstick in New York City that caused the mine to fail? But the Boss of the Bay mine was not the only company to go under. In 1883 and 1884, the yearbooks show that just 3 mining companies were left in operation. But what's interesting is that several of the men associated with the Milton mine, notably Charles Lewis, would go on to establish a new resort in town. By 1885, the category for the mines was gone completely, and all of the companies were out of business. John Schoenbar, the former superintendent of Lewis's Milton mine, is now listed as the proprietor of the Waukegan House, which he has renamed St. John's House. And in the next few years, Lewis and Schoenbar would form the Frenchman's Bay Land and Water Company, begin to buy land in the area, and establish Sorrento. Descriptions of both the Golden Circle and Treasure Island, the Golden Circle mine on Treasure Island and the Boss of the Bay mine were included in the bicentennial history of Sullivan, Maine. However, the story of the murder and the mistress associated with the mine were long forgotten by that time. What still exists today appears only to be the beginnings of what might have been a tunnel for the Boss of the Bay mine that can still be seen at the high tide mark along the shores of Sorrento, just past Blink Bonnie Golf Course.
Wow, that's.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sam, for that. It's so fascinating how the
Sorry
mining.
for the interruption.
Oh, we'll edit that out. But the mining boom, it was not just something of the West Coast. It was right here in Down East Maine too. And same things happened. The drama, people making a rush on the land, getting investors. And it's just so fascinating that that happened right in our own backyards. And you can still see where that mine was to have been there at low tide, which we'll have to hunt down sometime. And I was thinking about the Euler children, those poor children, but Mr. Euler did go on to become successful in the sugar business, so I guess they probably did all right, huh?
If somebody wants to do ancestry.com and tell them about the story, I'm sure some ancestors are somewhere.
Oh, definitely.
Out there.
All right. Well, does anyone have any questions for Sam? Let's say fascinating. Gotta love the 1880s. Yes, that was a wild time. Absolutely wild. So I will be putting the edited version of this presentation up on our YouTube channel, and I'll alert everyone when that's ready and send out links. And everyone, thank you so much for attending this evening. Sam, thank you so much for your research and your time. And everyone, tune in for our next history hour. We have yet to announce that topic, but we look forward to entertaining you all and learning more about our Sullivan and Sorrento history. All right, so everyone have a great night. Thank you again, Sam. Thanks
you all.
everyone for attending.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.